there are different ideas of what a utopia is. So right away, even before you get people confronting one another about these ideas, they're different. And then you may have a struggle with like, no, that's not utopia. Here, have mine.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Corollary number 1. Like stories, time wants to tell itself.
Like that, that's a good part to pick out. I'm Sean.
I'm Brandon.
And today we are obviously joined by the inspiring writer and editor, Nisi Shawl, winner of the James Tiptree Jr. Award for their short story collection, Filter House, co-author with Cynthia Ward of Writing the Other, Bridging Cultural Differences for Successful Fiction, editor of New Sons 2, original speculative fiction by people of color, and many short stories and other great things as well. And today we are talking about their new novel out from Tor, which is Kidding, the sequel to 2016's Everfair. Welcome to the show, Nisi.
Hi, glad to be here.
This is your first time on our show, by the way.
Yes,
Really?
yes.
We've
me.
never had Nisi on. I'm so glad.
So am I.
I wanted to do this before, but then I was too scared. But I'm not scared anymore. I am a brave little interviewer now.
Mm-hmm.
So I've gained some interview points. So there's one last thing, Brandon, you want to let folks know, and then we will dive into questions for Nisi.
Yes, before we begin, a friendly reminder to everyone listening and watching that we like to hear from you. So if you would like to talk to us about this and past episodes, you can do that at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. You can also join us on Discord, where we talk all the time and would like to listen to other people talk instead of just us. And you can also become a Patreon supporter, so you can financially support the show and actually be able to more directly engage with the kind of content that we make for the podcast. And also, if you're live with us today on Twitch, please feel free to ask questions, give your thoughts about Everfair, and continue to engage with us as we engage with this interview. So we're going to have a lot of fun tonight.
Absolutely. All right, so Nisi, the first question, the big one, well, it's not the big one. It's a big question, I suppose, which is, tell us about Kidding. What is this book?
This book is weird. No, has been my takeaway. It is a sequel to Everfair, as in it takes place in the year immediately after the end of Everfair, and it includes several characters from Everfair, Bilung and Tink, Princess Mwadi, Prince Ilunga. There are some others, some overlap. And the thing, though, is that I tell people also that, okay, there's going to be a third book, Truly's. And I know a little bit about it already. So, but Everfair, you could think of that as sort of a standalone, and then Kidding and Truly's as two parts of the same book set in the Everfair universe. Maybe.
Oh.
And notice how I skillfully avoided saying what happens in Kidding. Shall I rectify that now?
Sure, yeah. Give us like what's the basic story for folks that maybe haven't read it. Yeah. Well, can you even do that?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of a basic story here. So what happens is there's a revolution worldwide, and to help it along, Tink and Bilung take an air canoe around a certain route and try and distribute the spores of this empathy-inducing fungus that people can ingest and get pretty close to telepathy. more like telepathy, more empathy than thoughts, and some other sort of superpowers, and then things go horribly right.
I think that's a good place actually for a question I had to ask about, which
Okay.
is these spores, right? These empathy inducing spores that I don't know that I've seen. I mean, like you said, weird when you were first describing the book, and normally fungus would be like, oh, this is weird territory because fungus are weird, and yet this is a weird concept in a very fun and interesting way. And I was kind of curious where initially my first question is kind of where did that kind of come from, this idea of an empathy inducing spore that can be spread around to create, as you say, borrow your word, telepathy, essentially.
Well, so I was doing some reading, as you know, us nerds are prone to doing. And I was reading about something called the Wood Wide Web, not the World Wide Web, but the Wood Wide Web. And that is where the roots of trees in a forest communicate via fungal intermixing. Like they'll have like fungal sheaths around their roots, or they or stretching between them. And this is not just limited to, one species. It's like oaks talking to beech, and conifers talking to deciduous trees. Everybody's getting in on this wood wide web. So I thought that might be a nice way of communicating between different nations, different people, because it's so, to use the proper meaning of the word, so Catholic, so universal. But the other place that I got this idea from was from a book that I have not read because I do not know how to read Mandarin. It is a Chinese anarchist science fiction novel from the early 20th century. And in it, these Chinese anarchists distribute something called spirit medicine, which inclines people to become socialists.
Yeah, that sounds like medicine for the spirit, all right.
Yeah. And so I wanted to see, if I could invoke that also.
Mm-hmm. And it was
So
one.
you guys, you haven't heard about the Chinese anarchists with the
No.
No,
medicine?
that's a book that I'd very much like to read, in fact.
Well, do you read Mandarin?
I do not.
Not yet.
But surely someone
has,
must have translated it right. This sounds like
no
the
one
perfect
has
book to translate.
no one has translated it yet. If I had the money, I would be paying a translator now because I really want to read it.
Yeah.
That sounds exciting.
And especially like the frame in the book that I enjoyed so very much is the idea that um the abilities that one gets from that fungus also include the ability to tell whether someone is lying to you.
Yes.
And I found that like using that in this political sense is actually very interesting because it's not only that it's empathetic powers are allowing you to be more tightly emotionally connected to those around you, but that in political settings you can't be easily swayed by rhetoric in those kinds of circumstances. So you're simultaneously more likely to buy into your own groups and less likely to be won over by someone else's in this kind of interplay that I thought was really interesting as a frame. I kind of wanted to pick your brain about that in particular, using it in this political sense. Like what is the narrative goal? What do you want readers to like feel and think about the ways in which they engage with other people politically through the use of spirit medicine in the work?
Oh, I want them to experiment with different ways of relating to one another. Because while it is true, most of the time, and it is the belief of many of the people who've taken the spirit medicine that they can tell when someone's lying. If someone believes what they're saying, they're going to smell like they're telling the truth.
Mhm.
And so someone who is a convinced QAnon believer, for instance, they would not smell like they were lying because they would not believe that they were lying. So there is that. There are also people who find that kind of connection too intense and too smothering. So I it's not that I want one particular outcome for people who are for characters who are embracing the spirit medicine, but I want them to be involved in it. I want them to figure out what it means for them. I talk about my characters as if they're real people. Sorry, some of us writers do that, right?
Yeah.
Quite a few, actually. I think it's one of the most normal things about writing at this point.
If that's one of the normal things, I'm afraid of everything else. Um, so I
Yeah.
actually had a question about the format of the novel as well, because you said that it was a weird book, and especially format wise, um, I am inclined to agree. Like I like when books are very peculiarly formatted. So I love the fact that, for instance, every few chapters is broken by a brief interlude, and the fact that there are appendices at the back of the book that are less about the world itself and more about the act of engaging with history in the way that we are reading the book. Um, and especially the imaginary chapters were a thing that I wanted to ask you about, because it is very much about not only imagining what could be in the book, but asking the reader to think deeply about the act of reading and the act of thinking very deeply about history as an object, asking the reader to essentially imagine what would fill the spaces in between the book as they're reading it. And I really wanted to ask you, like, what was the impetus for framing that particular section in that way? Like, what inspired that actual idea, and what was the goal for it for the reader to get from that?
Mathematics.
Ooh.
The frame for this book, and don't ask me why it's this, but it is mathematics. So you were reading from the corollaries,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are the interludes are W, X, Y, and Z, which are they're variables in mathematical equations, and imaginary chapters, imaginary numbers.
Ah,
Ah.
And then there's chapter 0. And
Mm-hmm.
then
yeah.
it goes from there. Oh, no, you weren't reading the corollaries. You were reading the axioms. Sorry.
Right, yes. No,
Yeah.
no, I was reading the corollaries, in fact.
Oh, you were. Okay. All right. So yeah, it starts out with axioms, moves through the story, and then goes to corollaries. Why? I don't know. And I'm not sure if I'm going to do something similar, but with a different discipline for Trulies.
Ooh.
Hmm.
Maybe some other structure or format, like maybe recipes. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But this one definitely is mathematical. So yeah, I'm glad that you got something else out of it.
No, yeah, like even with that acknowledgement, the sections themselves, the text itself is still very engaging. But like, even because it sounds as if that was something that just kind of struck you without like necessarily having a conscious goal. And now I'm thinking more deeply that perhaps you had an inspirational thought that occurred there about how these things come together that is not, it doesn't emerge obviously through reading. It emerges less obviously through the reading, and now I'm curious to just kind of go back again and study these parts more and like try to figure out what that is, because I thought it was really inviting actually. Again, I
Oh,
like it.
good.
I like it when sections do weird things. Like the fact that the imaginary chapters are asking me to essentially consider what is happening after the things that you have described to me is actually really enticing to me as a reader. It's telling me that my reading is part of the work.
Yes,
Hmm.
yes, it is. Absolutely. What I was reading an interview with someone who they had been a sound engineer for Prince, and
Oh my goodness.
right, and then they started attending school and got a degree in neurology, a combined degree in neurology and music. And one of their assertions that I firmly believe is that music does not exist without listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And I would extend that to fiction. Stories do not exist without an audience. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you for getting into that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this leads me to one of the questions I really wanted to ask about, because you'd mentioned the axioms, which kind of give us some of the central shifts that have occurred in the world to give us this alternate history. And then this is followed by your, the first of your imaginary this imaginary chapters section, which gives us even kind of more of that sense of what makes this world so different. And I thought this was an interesting tactic, because in a lot of alternate history that I've read, and I'm certainly not super well versed, but a lot of it I've read, we kind of have to figure out what's different about the world. Sometimes it's not that hard. It's like like World War II, but like the other guy won, which is a little obvious. And so I kind of was curious in approaching making an alternate history, especially one where the focus of the shift is maybe not the place we usually think of as a space for alternate history. I'm really curious about what was the impetus for that, and also like the challenges of kind of deviating from the world we actually know and making this different one.
Well, that actually gets back to Everfair because Kinning really does follow along the events of Everfair. But the initial deviation was with the founding of the London School of Economics by the Fabian Socialists, this British group. What they did was they had some sort of inheritance, some large bundle of cash, and they used it to found the London School of Economics. But in my version, instead, they use it to buy a bunch of land from Leopold II of Belgium, because Leopold had, he just like commandeered all this huge region of Africa along the Congo River Basin, because he wanted wealth. So just give him the wealth and, proceed. And then that's what happened in Everfair. But just changing one thing like that really changes the trajectory of history. So that I found that, for instance, I had to change the outcome of World War One.
Yeah.
And then I looked at the effects that World War One had on our country, and they were huge. They were huge in terms of feminism. They were huge in terms of like the Harlem Renaissance came the out of the outcome of World War One. So yeah, the challenge. Talk about the challenge. And then as I continue with Kinning, I do some things as far as the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese anarchist movement. The May 4th movement, by the way, is an actual historically true anarchist movement. But I just gave them a little more room to work with. Uh, Yeah, I don't know what else. Oh, the flu. Oh gosh, the flu. That was a big one for me. Because the there's controversy as to where the influenza epidemic that took place at the end of World War I, where it got started, um, and how it got started. But by making the people of color in this time, in this timeline, more resistant to it because they had been exposed to a milder related version, that changed the whole geopolitics, right? And I extended that to kinning, including like the erroneous assumption of what caused the resistance.
Hmm.
Well, and there's a question in chat from Paul, and I think this is a question I would have asked too. Is, as you make this changes, you hinted a little earlier that suddenly there's almost like a cascade, right? That if
Yes.
you're really trying to make it all work, like, and as we get into this novel, right, you now have all the time from the previous novel, then all the time in this book for even more change to occur as a consequence of the butterfly effect, as they sometimes call it. And as a writer, did you how do you try to keep that coherent, I guess, for the reader or even for yourself as the writer, since you've got it all in your head, if you can, I guess.
Well, yeah. I don't know that I kept it coherent for some people. Let's just say the book has its critics, and I cannot fault those who find it difficult to follow, because I was making color-coded charts for myself, right? And like spreadsheets of like who got this influenza when, and who got the spirit medicine, and who got the Russian cure, which is the rival for it, and when did they have both? I mean, yeah, it takes some tracking just for the events of that novel, let alone for the two novels. I did okay, so Everfair is like 30 years. Um, Kinning is a year and a half. So I did like just focus on a narrower uh time range. So at least I had that going for me. But otherwise, I am not using any software. I'm using like legal pads and
Hmm.
yeah.
History done the
Help.
Do
natural way,
you?
like everyone else.
Sorry, I was talking. I didn't.
Oh, you're doing history the natural way, like everyone else.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm sure by the time I get to the third book, I will have figured out something else that will help.
Hmm.
One of the follow-up questions to this says is more a practical question. If someone's going to read Everfair for the first time, do you personally think the the print text or the audio version is would be your preference?
That's a really hard one. I would say that people learn in different ways. They process information in a variety of ways. One person I know actually listened to the book while reading it, and that
Oh.
was their method. I prefer to read things because then I can like stop and go back and find what I was looking at before. But not necessarily, it's easier to do that, in fact, with an electronic book than it is with uh, a print book, because you can just search on a word, where am I seeing hash mark? I remember that was part of the passage. Um, so yeah, I will say that I adore Allison Johnson, who was the reader for both the Kinning and the Everfair audiobooks. Allison is very, very careful, and she looks for the correct pronunciation of all of these names that are like not in English. All the place names, all the character names, terms that I I just wrote them. I wouldn't have thought that they required research, but apparently they do. So I do recommend the audiobooks highly. But as to whether I recommend them over the printed versions, I leave that as an exercise to the audience.
Ah, great. I
Nice.
will say personally, I was reading the book as an ebook on the plane, and I got to this point where I was like, I need the book in my hand. I need to be able, because I find it a little easier for me to like flip back and forth between the pages, and to remember passages by like seeing the way the page looks, the way the lines are laid out. I
Okay.
can remember pages that way. And so I was at the Minneapolis airport, like I know there's two bookstores in here. It's got to be in here somewhere, and it was not, and I was disappointed. So, but I went looking. It was like I can't. I want to buy the book right now. So if you're like me, the physical book, for at least for Kinning, would might work for you. But again, the great audiobook readings are always appreciated. And so do check out audio. I like audiobooks too, so I would recommend still checking them out nonetheless.
Mhm. So I wanted to follow up on the history question that Sean had asked. Specifically,
Mm,
um on a narrative level, one of the things that I think is most interesting about both Everfair and Kinning, and especially Kinning in this sense, is the idea that there is an obviously utopian world building goal that people have in their minds, but the story is about how that goal is very difficult to achieve because of the machinations of certain people, even people who otherwise do strongly have that goal in mind, um, will often seek to claim power or seek to control the ability for other people to gain power in that world. In particular, I'm thinking of how the two siblings at the core of the story of
mm,
Everfair are still essentially representatives of a state that is fostering very positive ideals
mm,
politically in the overall world at that time, but are still struggling to determine which one of them deserves to be the ruler of their kingdom. Um, in a way that I thought was particularly interesting. Like, how do we navigate both having capital U utopian goals and still struggling with the desire for power or other people's desire for power? And I wanted to pick your brain about that as well. Like, what was the narrative and political value of telling the story of those kind of warring personalities within those characters?
So for me, the idea of utopia begs the question, whose utopia? Because some of us want a utopia that's like, I get to stay at home with my cat and, people bring me flowers and food and then other people are like, my utopia involves everybody coming out of their house at the same time and clasping hands and singing a song, a rousing song. There are different ideas of what a utopia is. So right away, even before you get people confronting one another about these ideas, they're different. And then you may have a struggle with like, no, that's not utopia. Here, have mine. Uh, and that I think is a very realistic way of depicting utopia. Um, I can see, how this could be resolved, but I'm not going to tell you until the third book.
Aha. You heard it here first, folks. Definitely buy the entire trilogy now. You are now bound to that.
Well, I love that you mentioned, that the complexities of trying to establish any kind of utopian vision, which can be affected by all manners of ways in which people are raised or grow up, or the political philosophy they subscribe to, and that makes for, like sometimes science fiction can get a criticism for like, oh, they magically made all of the planet, all the countries are friends now, and they made a planetary government and everything works just fine. And I think to some degree, Kidding kind of shows that this is a much more murky and difficult process, and it's not as simple as just getting people to agree. It can take, as Brandon's pointing out, a lot of power dynamics and relations that can get very complicated, even deeply personal. And I guess, Winston, why do you have to do this to me right now, you ridiculous creature? Sorry for those who are listening at the podcast version. Winston has made an appearance because he wants to be held, and mid sentence he decided to cross my face. Anyway, I'm sorry. And I guess to some degree, would you see there's this concept in utopian studies, which is like the critical utopia, and like the text everyone cites is the dispossessed. And I don't know if you see this work as maybe somewhat engaging in that idea of a critical utopia. I'm curious
Absolutely.
where you would see. Okay.
Absolutely, yes. And I've read The Dispossessed twice, and I also think that I think that we need a different word for the process of utopiaing or something like that. Because it's not that it's an unworthy goal. It's something that creating utopia is something that we want to do. We, as humans, it's part of our practice. It's what we do. But just to think that the work is ever actually finished is a little problematic. A little, yeah.
Well, I mean, it dawns on me too that a part of that is if you take the world of Everfair and Kidding as your example, I mean, surely in creating any utopia from any framework, someone's point of view gets lost in that conversation because it doesn't fit a specific vision. And I don't know, can you imagine a utopian future in which all points of view are equally represented? I don't know if that's
I can.
that seems to me you
You
can.
can.
You think that's possible? Oh,
That's
I'm
why
I'm curious.
Third book.
that's why I'm writing the third book. Yes.
Oh, okay.
I am very intrigued now.
I am
because I was going to follow up on
Okay.
Sean's statement, like a lot of the conflict of utopianizing a space, or as Triffity Mats mentions in chat, the potential word that we can use is utopiation. The inherent conflict is that you can even agree with other people about a political goal, and the means by which it can be accomplished can be various widely different means throughout all of those communities, in ways where finding the way to pursue a course of action can be a source of conflict throughout those spaces, and that leads to a breakdown in communication that makes continuing that project harder.
Yeah.
And the idea now that there is a way in which you can have your disagreement and solve the problem too is actually really appealing to me. And I think that that's ultimately appealing to the world as well. Like everybody, it reads to me that the world, in the sense that the world is a character, wants to be complete in that sense, wants everybody to get what they want. But because there are different political factions that may or may not seek the same goals, the struggle is, how do we get those things to come together? And I'm very curious to see what that will look like in the third book as a result. Like, how do you beat colonialism and still let Europeans be your allies? Like, I'm curious.
Oh.
Well, I will just say that again, reading reviews that I should not have read. Someone said that well, this whole fungus thing reads like horror to me. It doesn't read like utopia at all. And I'm like, yeah, you got it, girl. That is the effect that I was going for. It is, for some people, it is horror. And some people even on the same side in Kidding, they're like, yes, I want to join your revolution. No, I am not snorting that.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. You know, I'm along with you for this ride, but I'm not getting on the horse, basically. Um, yeah, like you're saying, we have the same goals, but how are we going to achieve that?
Yeah.
That is where we differ.
Hmm.
And I wanted to
This
read, sorry, I wanted to read, because we're talking about the means to the end. Um, the big fat clue that I put as a statement at the beginning of the book, was the Wikipedia quote. Anarchists of the May 4th movement refused to distinguish between means and ends, holding that the process of revolution lay in the creation of the future society in the present.
Hmm.
That's how you resolve that issue. You mush together means and ends.
Yeah.
I must say, I don't know that if you've ever had an author just throw like a bombshell statement about a book that isn't out yet that made me more excited for that book. Uh, because what you just did was, so one of my favorite things in science fiction, and maybe this will lead to a question or a thought from you, is like the book that's trying to do something, even if it doesn't succeed. It's just trying to do something different or trying to push the envelope on some concept or some idea and taking it to its logical conclusion or illogical one if you're Philip K. Dick. Right? And once you tell me that you're trying to answer this question, you're trying to imagine a possible solution, that very idea to me already is super exciting. I mean, I just want to see that because that makes me go, okay, I want to. This is what the so much great science fiction does: is it asks a question and then it tries to offer an answer, and even when the answer is bananas, it still can be super interesting to read and see how people approach those questions quite seriously. And so I don't know if that's how you think of science fiction or genre fiction more broadly, but when I think you just made me feel so excited. I feel like a little jittery inside right now. I it's not even out yet, and I want it.
Yeah, it's not even written yet, y'all.
But you still know the answer. That intrigues us even more.
But I'm 68 years old, so am I gonna make it?
Ah, we're gonna make you
I
make
think
it.
so. No,
I'm adding you to
Yeah,
my prayers
know.
every night.
Everfair took 6 years to write. Kinning took 6 years to write. You do the math.
I have to believe that that's
That
six
is
years of things becoming so sharp and perfect that when we get it, it will blow our minds.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Hope so.
well. That leads me to a question, actually. So this is great because the Everfair came out in 2016. It's now 2024. Hard to believe it's 2024. We're a quarter into a new century, people. I just want you to think about that for a minute. If you thought that you were young, anybody at home, um, but you mentioned that it took you 6 years to write. And I guess like in that is a hard, long span of time for writing. And so originally my question was, what was it like coming back? But since I know you were kind of working on it through that whole period, I guess this is more a process question of how exactly do you write when you're kind of putting together a work like this? Is this just like a slow plotting kind of thing, or is it chaos and then it becomes reason at some point? What does that process look like?
It is very slow. Um, and actually, I did not start writing this. I did not start writing Kinning immediately upon the publication or even upon the turning in of the manuscript for Everfair, because I was told that there was no interest in a sequel by the publisher.
They're wrong.
But they changed their mind when the Black Panther movie came out.
Oh,
Suddenly they were like, oh yeah, wait a minute. You know what?
Yeah, maybe there is some interest in seeing a territory in Africa be reclaimed by its community. I
Yeah,
wonder,
yeah.
could anything have told us that this is a thing that people wanted before?
hmm.
So yeah, so as far as the process, I am a very, very slow writer. I am not one of those writers that I hear about all the time who like, just go blah and get it out on the page and then they can fix it. That is not me. I will rewrite it. I will try and fix it. But I have to be happy enough with what I'm writing to put it on the screen before I move on. And I think the most I've written in one day, and as far as word count, is 800 words. Generally, it's between 300 and 500. So yeah, it's very slow. Like Anthony Trollope, slow. Anthony Trollope was a Victorian novelist. Yeah,
Mhm.
very slow.
I mean, 300 is still very manageable a day.
It is if you keep grinding 7 days a week, which I do, which I do. I won't necessarily be writing days that I'm traveling because that takes a lot out of me. Or days when I'm like presenting at a conference or something like that. But otherwise, no excuse. I'm there. I'm doing it.
Mhm.
Let me tell
Interesting.
you, that was a challenge during these lockdown years. Whoa.
I can
Oh
only
yeah.
imagine, especially considering that. I guess a question I'll ask as a follow up, if you feel comfortable answering that kind of question, was whether um reckoning with the influenza as a plot in Kinning was a thing that emerged as a result of the pandemic or became more complicated as a result of the pandemic, or if you were already kind of through that phase of the story by the time that had happened.
Well, I had started with the influenza elements in Everfair well before we had any inkling that there was going to be a excuse me, that there was going to be a pandemic. Well before that. So what happened was with Kinning, I realized, oh, this is kind of resonant with that. But where I really had to think about things and change them was one of the people in my critique group pointed out that in an earlier version of Kinning, I had a Chinese woman, Bilung, distributing a spore for, what could be seen as a disease, and it could be seen as sort of a metaphor for the Wuhan lab version of COVID. So especially as in earlier versions, there was a lot less consent. So yeah,
Mhm.
that
That is
that I had to change that.
that is interesting because to some degree people are going to read any work, even if it was, like the books that came out kind of like the year after COVID. If it featured anything vaguely pandemic-y, everyone's going to interpret it within that
Yeah.
context, even if it was written 2 or 3 years prior, right? And I guess what we're hearing from you is that when you were working on Kinning, you suddenly became aware that how you told the story could have an impact you didn't intend,
Yes.
and thus you had to make an adjustment accordingly, which is a very interesting thing to hear an author say, because you wanted to make a different point and you had to make that more clear in adjusting the way this narrative resulted.
Yeah, yeah. And I also I had to do a few things to make Bilung more sympathetic. Um, because early versions of her, everyone saw her as the villain, and I'm like, what? No, she's just a pharmacist. Um,
Yeah.
Just a lowly pharmacist, no big
I
deal.
mean, again, to the point of how do we frame the story for the reader, the book is coming out after a period where a large portion of uh the population did in fact see all pharmacists as enemies. So
Oh,
yeah, engaging kind of deeply with
yeah.
how do I ensure that my intention reads properly for a reader who is coming in with their own experiences and their own biases is actually the kind of thing, as Sean said, most writers don't ever actually publicly acknowledge, and when they do, it's like,
Oh,
nope, that's not. I'm gonna give it to you the way that it occurred in my brain, no matter what. It's like, I get, like, I feel like there is tremendous value as writers and readers knowing that there are writers who are that thoughtful and will confess to being that thoughtful on a regular basis.
well, like I said, just the reader is part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is what I tell my students, right? When you're writing, and even just like a nonfiction essay, an argument, you have to think about who your intended audience is,
Yeah.
right? You have to respond to them. You can't just write how you think in your head because not everybody's going to be receptive in the same way.
Yep.
You have to think about them. Yeah. And normally I mean, I say normally, often we don't hear this coming from fiction writers, even if it is part of some writers' processes as it is in yours. So perhaps that's something we do need to think about in conversations about writing and like writing workshops, as making that a part of the conversation, is really think about the reader and how elements of your story may be received based on what's going on in the world. That may be a thing. There's like a sensitive way to address that I'm not equipped to have, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what's coming. The world is in a weird state lately.
Yeah.
I say lately, like basically my entire life. It's just getting more ridiculous in some respects. So, yeah.
So I wanted to so I wanted to come back to the conversation about how long it had taken you to work on these books. In particular because you had also commented on the effort that is required to keep track of the history that you had created for this world in comparison to real history. And I was kind of curious all of a sudden how much of that process was actually the process of reading historical texts, taking your own notes, like how much of that time was actually just about getting the timeline to the point where you wanted it, and not necessarily just about the act of writing the work itself.
I well, first of all, I want to say that, and sort of related, although it's not necessarily the answer to your question. I had actually written three other sequels. Let's see, Balkanization, Slippernet, four other sequels to Everfair, short stories.
Ah,
These are things that happened mostly between the end of Everfair and the beginning of Kinning. There's a short story. I think they're coming up on Tor now. One of them's already up there. Let's see. Those were what were those? Boy, being old, I tell you, I need a new brain. One of them was Sun River, and one of them was The Colors of Money. And Sun River, I'm pretty sure, is up at tor.com, or Reactor as we're calling it right now. And then Vulcanization is a sequel, sort of. It's a horror story from Leopold's viewpoint. And I have definitely kept Leopold off the stage. He was not on the page at all. And then I did this short story from his viewpoint, and it was nasty. I had to scrub down afterwards, just being in that head. He used the N-word profligately. And then the final one, it was called Slippernet, and that's set sort of after the end of Truly's.
oh,
That should be an evil cackle there. Yes.
hmm.
Yeah, Slippernet, and that is going to be on tor.com/reactor also. So
Aha.
I guess my point is that I had not strayed too far from thinking about this world. this was, it was still in my mind. Now, as far as the research, was I trying to put together a timeline? No, I am of the school of people who, I write a little, I research a little, I research a little, I write a little, I go back and forth. I'm able to do that without falling down research rabbit holes. I also don't do the thing where, you put like all caps text and say, and then a miracle occurs, and you go on with the rest of the story. Because I have to know what miracle, because it might change, the next chapter or the next paragraph or the next page. So going back and forth for the desired effect, looking for what happens, looking for what that means, looking for how it plays out, and then what would come next. Does that answer the question?
It does.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
The great answer. And I've put those links, they'll be in the show notes to the stories, Sun River Vulcanization and Slippernet, which I think was originally on Slate, or at least Slate has an article mentioning it if it wasn't the story.
It was.
And then presumably it'll be on Reactor, which you'd mentioned. So people will have that. It's in chat, and it's also going to be in the show notes for the show, so folks can go read those and also buy 8,000 copies of Kenny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we kind of need to wind down. I'm sure we could ask you many more questions, but you have a life, and you were cooking before this, if I understood stove before, so you might have some form of food to consume. So let's start with our wind down questions, and one of them is one that you may be able to talk about or not, which is, what are you working on next that you are allowed to tell us about?
Oh, well, I'm doing revisions and updates to Writing the Other, A Practical Approach, the book on Writing the Other. So that's what I'm working on that I can talk about. I just finished receiving the proofs of a short story called, this is where I lose track of the titles again. Over a Long Time Ago, which is a line from my favorite band, Steely Dan. Shout out to Steely Dan. Over a Long Time Ago, it's part of this series of short stories I wrote about interstellar prison colony.
Oh.
Yeah. And so that one's going to be up on Nightmare in May. And then in September, I believe, the further away from the election night, the better. But in September, Rosarium is going to publish my Beat era fantasy novella. Let me take a minute to talk about that. So you all know who Jack Kerouac was, right? Jack Kerouac fictionalized his life. That was how he made his bread. So one of his novels, The Subterraneans, is about his fling with a Black woman. In the book, he called her Mardu Fox. Her real name was Aileen Lee. She was an author. She was just as good, if not better, an author than Jack Kerouac. But of course, Black woman, not going to get published in like 1952, right? Yeah. So my book is called The Day and Night Books of Mardu Fox, and it's a series of journal entries by Aileen Lee, inspired by Aileen Lee, who about her interactions with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and Gregory Corso and all those people.
Oh.
And also magic.
I'm very intrigued by this.
I'm very curious too. I'd never heard of Aileen Lee before, and now I want to go read everything I can about her.
Yeah, well, yeah, you look her up. I think she has a Wikipedia article, and there's a couple other things, and there's some writing samples. Good stuff. And of course, she
Ooh, okay.
hated what Jack wrote about her.
Oh,
Aileen Lee has a
I mean,
Wikipedia page that is literally 3 sentences long. That's how upset
Oh.
I am. So
most of it
very
just
upset.
about yeah, almost all of it is about Jack
Yeah.
Kerouac. Yeah. But yeah, there are some links there that may lead to some more information, which I will be pulling up immediately
Mhm.
because I'm very curious.
Yeah.
So,
So
thank you
so
for
we're going to
giving
look
me
out for
both a
that.
novella to look forward to. Yeah.
And of course, our second
All right,
question
last
is,
question.
where can folks find you on the internet and elsewhere?
Uh, I am really taken with Blue Sky these days.
Mhm.
Yeah, y'all found me on Blue Sky too, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun right now. I don't know if the fun will last, but it is fun. And I have an Instagram account with which I do basically diddly squat, and Facebook, yeah. And
You also have a webpage.
yeah, but come on. I think the last copyright on there was from like 2017 or something.
Oh,
It's I need to update that thing.
Hey, take this as
fair
invitation to
enough.
do so.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I'm great. Great. Oh, that's right. You have the dark matter on there. Oh, I love that collection. It's so good. Matter's so good. Sorry, I'm on your website, and I was looking to. I just quickly scrolled down the title covers, and I saw Dark Matter, and I was like, oh, I love that collection. It's so good.
That was put together by Cherie Renee Thomas, and that is phenomenal work.
Mhm.
I would argue it's one of the top 5 most important collections of literature probably ever released.
Okay, I'll go with that.
But that's my opinion. So nobody has to accept it, but they're wrong if they don't. just teasing.
I accept it, and I
just
believe
really
that they
think
are
it's
wrong.
great. It's also got, I believe, Like Daughter by Tananarive in there, which is one of my favorite short stories ever. I could talk about anyway. I'm sorry. I could ramble. I apologize.
Yes. In any other circumstance, we would allow Sean to ramble, but
not today.
we should in fact close. So again, thank you so very
Yeah.
much, Nisi, for joining us this evening. We're so glad we got to talk to you about Kinning, and we are very excited for everything that you have coming next.
Yay!
Awesome. So for folks at home, this is just a reminder, if you've got listener thoughts, whatever, listener suggestions, skiffingfanty.com/listener suggestions or skiffingfanty@gmail.com if you want to send us an email if you've got thoughts about the book, or you just, I don't know, you just want to rave about how much you liked Everfair and Kinning, that's fine too. We'll take those. We're Skiffing Fanty on most places and have a newsletter and a Patreon, and you can just go to Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skiffingfanty, and there's links to basically everywhere we are. I'm obviously here Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 for non-Skiffy stuff, and then every Friday at 6:30 p.m. we have some Skiffy thing going on, so you can watch us there. And my Linktree is just /Sean Duke.
Mm-hmm. And you can find me almost everywhere on the internet at The Rising Tides. That's TITHES. My newsletter, which is also my website, at brandonobrien.xyz, and at speculatorsf.com.
Perfect. All right, as required by the Skiffing Fanty bylaws, I will make this awkward now.
You don't have to.
Bye. No, sorry, the bylaws say so. We all agree to these bylaws, so I must make it incredibly awkward.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna go run in the street and yell the word Leopold for no reason, just to see how the neighbors react.
You know what? I also want to know how the neighbors will react. Please be safe.
I'll probably get arrested.
Take care of yourself, please.
All right, folks. And on that note, awkward ending, and see you. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.